Some inheritances arrive wrapped in silk and signed by accountants. Others arrive disguised as insults. If you had been standing at the back of that wood-paneled conference room in downtown Chicago on the morning of October 14th, watching a 36-year-old elementary school teacher get handed a cracked pocket watch in front of a room full of people who despised her, you would have assumed she'd lost everything. You would have been wrong. The offices of Hartwell and Crane occupied the 22nd floor of a building that smelled like mahogany polish and inherited money. The receptionist wore pearls. The carpet was a shade of burgundy that announced, quietly but firmly, that your problems weren't welcome here unless they came attached to a 7-figure estate. Maya Holloway, 36, did not belong in a place like this, and she knew it the moment the elevator doors opened, and she stepped out still wearing her quilted barn jacket and the sensible flats she wore to parent-teacher conferences. She'd driven 4 hours from Rockford that morning. She hadn't slept. Her checking account held $214, a number she knew precisely because she'd checked it twice on her phone in the parking garage downstairs, a habit born of 3 months watching it shrink since her mother died, and the substitute teaching income started bleeding out faster than it came in. Her mother, Patricia Holloway, had been a quiet woman who collected ceramic owls and grew tomatoes on a fire escape, and never once in 62 years asked anyone for anything she didn't absolutely need. Patricia had also, without telling a single soul, been legally married for 11 years to a man named Gerald Fitch. Gerald Fitch, 64, was not quiet. Gerald Fitch wore monogrammed cufflinks to a Tuesday morning estate reading. He sat at the head of the long conference table with the easy confidence of a man who'd already calculated the outcome and found it satisfactory. Beside him sat his son from a previous marriage, Derek Fitch, 41, who had the particular look of someone who'd coasted his whole adult life on his father's gravitational pull. Derek ran a consulting firm with a website that hadn't been updated since 2019, and a LinkedIn page full of endorsements traded with college friends for mutual ego inflation. Across the table at the far end sat Maya. She hadn't known about Gerald until after her mother's funeral. She hadn't known about the marriage, the joint accounts, the property deed. Not because Patricia was ashamed, but because Patricia had been methodical in the way quiet women sometimes are, keeping her life in separate compartments the way she kept her ceramic owls on separate shelves, each one belonging to its own world. Margaret Osey, the estate attorney, was a compact woman in her late 50s, with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. The unhurried manner of someone who'd watched every register of human behavior play out across a conference table and was no longer surprised by any of it. She opened the folder in front of her without ceremony. "We're here for the reading of the last will and testament of Patricia Holloway Fitch," she said. "I'll ask everyone to hold questions until I've finished." Gerald nodded as though presiding over a board meeting. Derek leaned back and crossed his ankles. The estate wasn't enormous, but it was more than Maya had understood her mother to have. A savings account, $80,000, accumulated over 3 decades of careful living. The Rockford house, paid off, assessed at $240,000, a modest investment portfolio, and something called the Hartwell Land Trust, which Margaret mentioned briefly, without elaboration, and which Maya had never heard of. Gerald received the savings account in full. He received the investment portfolio. He received right of first refusal on the Rockford house, meaning that if the estate sold it, he could match any offer. Derek received the car, a nearly new Subaru Maya had helped her mother pick out 2 summers before. Then Margaret turned the page. "To my daughter, Maya Holloway," she read, and the attention in the room shifted, almost imperceptibly. "I leave the contents of the cedar box in my closet, specifically the pocket watch that belonged to her grandfather. I know she will understand." Gerald made a sound in his throat that wasn't quite a laugh, more controlled than that, a small exhale through the nose, the sound of a man confirming a private suspicion. Derek was less restrained. A watch, he said, turning to Maya with the particular smile men like Derek deploy when they want to wound someone without technically saying anything cruel. Didn't Grandpa wear that thing every day? I thought it was broken. Gerald laid a hand on his son's arm, not to silence him, but the way a conductor lowers a baton, signaling that the performance had reached a satisfying resolution and the music could rest. Margaret opened the cedar box beside her folder, lifted out the watch, and slid it down the table toward Maya. It traveled the length of the mahogany in what felt like slow motion, coming to rest directly in front of her, face up, the crack running across the crystal like a fault line, the second hand frozen at 4:47. Her grandfather's watch. Eugene Holloway had worn it every day for 40 years. It stopped running sometime in the 90s, and he'd refused to have it repaired, on the grounds that he'd learned to read people better than clocks. Maya had held it at his funeral when she was 14. She remembered the weight of it. She picked it up. The room went very quiet. I suppose the pension will kick in eventually, Gerald said, not looking at her, straightening a cuff. And the substitute work is steady enough in the meantime, I trust. Maya didn't answer. She closed her fingers around the watch, the cracked glass pressing into her palm, and looked at Gerald Fitch with an expression she wouldn't be able to name later. Not hatred, not grief, something colder and more focused than either. She stood. She didn't push her chair back for effect, or say anything that would give them material for later. She simply rose, tucked the watch into her jacket pocket, and walked out with her spine straight and her jaw set. She made it to the hallway before her hands started shaking. The hallway outside the conference suite was a long corridor of frosted glass and recessed lighting, the kind built to make you feel like you were walking through an expensive idea. Maya stood at the far end of it, one hand braced against the wall, telling herself with real effort that she was not going to cry in a law firm that billed $400 an hour. She was not succeeding when she heard the quick, purposeful click of low heels behind her. Miss Holloway. She turned. Margaret Osey was walking toward her, reading glasses now folded in one hand, the professional neutrality gone from her face, and something that looked unexpectedly like urgency in its place. Mr. Fitch's counsel is still in the conference room, Margaret said, low and even. Walk with me. Don't ask questions in the hallway. I don't understand. I know walk. They moved through a door marked staff into a small break room, a Keurig machine, a round table with mismatched chairs, a whiteboard scrawled with case numbers in blue marker. Margaret shut the door, checked that it had latched, and turned to face Maya with the expression of someone finally allowed to set down something heavy. Your mother contacted me 14 months ago, she said, not through Gerald, through her own separate retainer, paid out of a personal account he didn't know existed. She paused. Your mother was a great deal more deliberate than people gave her credit for. Something shifted in Maya's chest. What does that mean? It means the will you just heard read was constructed precisely for that room and that audience. Gerald's attorneys have been reviewing Patricia's estate documents for 8 months. He knew exactly what that will said. That's what your mother intended. She needed him to believe he'd won. The Keurig hummed in the corner. Down the hall, a phone rang twice and stopped. There's a second document, Margaret said, a codicil executed separately, witnessed by 2 independent parties, filed with the Cook County Probate Court under a sealed docket 3 weeks before your mother died. It can't be contested, it can't be litigated away, and Gerald Fitch's attorneys have no idea it exists. Maya sat down without deciding to. Your mother knew Gerald was skimming from the joint accounts, Margaret continued. She'd been documenting it for 2 years. Small transfers at first, to an LLC he controlled, reimbursement claims for expenses she never approved. By the time she understood the full scope, he'd moved roughly $340,000 through instruments she couldn't touch without triggering a legal fight she didn't have the strength for. She was already sick. She never told me. She didn't want you in the crossfire. Margaret's voice softened fractionally. She said, and I'm quoting her exactly, "If Gerald knows Maya matters to me, Maya becomes leverage." So she made you invisible. She made herself look like she favored him in every way that could be documented or overheard. Margaret looked at her over the rim of her glasses. She asked me to tell you it was the hardest thing she ever did. Maya pressed her thumb against the cracked glass, still in her palm. The edge of the crack caught her skin. "She left you a note," Margaret said, "but first, look at the watch again." "It's broken." "Look again." It was a standard railroad pocket watch, gold-filled case, white enamel face. Her grandfather had bought it in 1958. She'd looked at it 1,000 times over the years. Margaret leaned in, the winding crown. "Turn it counterclockwise 3 times, then press it in." Maya set her thumbnail against the small ridged crown, turned it left. Once, twice, 3 times, pressed. A faint, precise click, mechanical and deliberate, at the very edge of hearing. The back panel released, swinging open on an almost invisible hinge. The inside wasn't a standard movement that had been removed years ago, replaced with a shallow cavity. Wrapped in a strip of wax paper no wider than a thumbnail were 2 things. A folded square of paper the size of a post-it and a small modern key with a numbered tag. Maya unfolded the note. Her mother's handwriting, careful, looping cursive, the hand of a woman who'd taken penmanship seriously. "The key is for a safe deposit box at First Northern Bank, Montpelier, Vermont. Box 1147. Everything you need is inside. I am so sorry for the watch. I needed them to think it was nothing. You were never nothing. You were the whole point. Go to Vermont, Maya. Mom." Maya sat with that for a long time. Margaret didn't rush her. "Vermont," Maya finally said. "Your mother bought a property there in 2019. Margaret said, "Through a land trust, the Hartwell Land Trust named in the public will." Gerald assumed it was a nominal asset the estate would absorb. What he doesn't know is that the Hartwell Land Trust has nothing to do with this firm. The name is a coincidence your mother chose deliberately. It's administered by a private fiduciary in Burlington, and as of the date of your mother's death, it transferred entirely to you. What property? Margaret allowed herself a small, quiet pause. "Drive to Vermont, Miss Holloway. You'll understand when you see it." Maya drove. Through Indiana, across Ohio, up through New York, and into the green hills of Vermont over 2 days, stopping once at a Motel 6 outside Syracuse, where she lay on top of the bedspread with her coat still on, and let herself cry properly for the first time since the conference room. She cried for her mother. For the 11 years of a marriage she hadn't known about, the 2 years of quiet documentation, the deliberate distance Patricia had built to keep her out of Gerald's line of sight. She cried because the woman who'd raised her alone on a teacher's salary, who grew tomatoes on a fire escape and never asked anyone for anything, had spent the last years of her life running a careful, solitary operation to make sure her daughter would be all right, entirely alone. While Maya sat in Rockford teaching 3rd grade reading comprehension, and her mother sat across a dinner table from the man stealing from her and smiled and passed the bread. She reached Montpelier on a Thursday morning. First Northern Bank was a small, serious building on State Street that smelled like old stone and radiated the quiet authority of an institution that had kept secrets longer than most of its customers had been alive. The woman at the safe deposit desk had the manner of someone who understood discretion as a form of service. She verified Maya's ID, verified the key, and led her to a private viewing room without a single question. Box 1147 wasn't large. What it held was staggering in its precision. A manila envelope in Patricia's hand. "Read this first. Inside, a 4-page letter and a USB drive. A deed to a property called Hollow Creek Farm, 340 acres, Lamoille County, Vermont, held in the Hartwell Land Trust, assessed at $1.4 million. A certified appraisal of the property's mineral rights. A natural spring aquifer a bottled water company had been trying to license for 6 years, valued at roughly $3.2 million in licensing potential. a folder of financial records documenting Gerald's transfers from the joint accounts, annotated in her mother's hand, and a sealed, stamped, already signed envelope addressed to the Vermont State Attorney General's office, containing a formal fraud complaint with 18 months of documentation enclosed. Maya read her mother's letter at the table in that private room, and there is no clean way to describe the experience, because it wasn't one feeling but many, arriving at once the way weather systems collide. Patricia Holloway had been a woman who believed in doing things properly. The letter was dated 8 months before she died, written while she was still lucid and still angry, a quiet, considered anger, the kind that only comes from thinking something through for a very long time. Maya. If you're reading this, then Margaret did her job, and Gerald did exactly what I knew he would. Took everything he could reach and left you what he assumed was nothing. He assumes this because he doesn't understand that what I gave you isn't an old broken watch. What I gave you is the only thing I couldn't let him touch. I hid it in the one place he'd never look, something he'd already decided was worthless. The farm is real. It's been real for 6 years. I found it the summer you and I drove through Vermont, and you said it was the most beautiful place you'd ever seen. I saved for 4 years and bought it. I know you'll think I should have told you. Maybe. But I wanted it to exist first, solid, real, and in your name, before anyone could interfere. The drive has everything you need. Gerald stole from me. I documented it. Use it however you see fit. But no, I didn't do any of this out of bitterness. I did it because I wanted you to have a floor under your feet. You've spent 12 years teaching other people's children to read, for a salary that barely covers your rent. And you never once complained to me. Not once. I know, because I was watching. Go see the farm, my girl. The caretaker is Tom Albright. He's managed it since 2020. He's good and honest, and he knows who you are. He's expecting you. I love you. I loved you before you existed, and I'll love you after I don't. That's the thing about mothers. We love you in tenses you don't have words for yet. The watch was your grandfather's. He'd have wanted you to have it. The compartment was my addition. He'd have approved of that too. Mom. Maya sat with that letter for a long time. Then she picked up the drive, tucked it into her jacket pocket beside the watch, stood, and drove 45 minutes north into Lamoille County. Hollow Creek Farm sat at the end of a gravel road that curved through sugar maples, so old their roots had cracked, and heaved the road's edge into gentle waves. It was mid-October, and the maples were doing what Vermont maples do in mid-October, an act of extravagant beauty that feels almost aggressive in its insistence that the world is worth looking at. Red and orange and gold, reflected in the creek running along the western edge of the property, with the farmhouse itself set at the top of a low rise, looking out over all of it with the settled, unpretentious dignity of a building that had been doing its job for over a century. It wasn't a mansion. A white clapboard New England farmhouse with a wraparound porch and green shutters, a barn attached by a breezeway. Exactly the kind of thing Maya had once pointed at through a car window and said, without thinking, that she'd give anything to live somewhere like that. Tom Albright, 58, broad-shouldered, weathered, with the patience of someone who'd spent 30 years in partnership with land and seasons, was on the porch when she pulled up. He pulled off his work gloves and offered his hand. Mrs. Holloway, your mother told me you'd come. I'm glad you made it. She talked to you about me? Every time she visited, he held the door open. Come in. I just made coffee. Maya walked into her mother's farmhouse for the first time. It smelled of wood smoke and pine and the clean cold of a Vermont autumn. She stood in the kitchen with both hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, looked out at the maples and the creek, and let that be enough for a moment before she asked Tom to tell her everything. He told her. The farm had been operational since 2021, a small organic hay operation, quietly managed, generating modest revenue that had been accumulating in the trust account. Spring on the eastern slope was the real story. A company called Cascade Pure had been trying to negotiate a licensing agreement for 4 years. Patricia had turned down every offer on the grounds that the decision belonged to her daughter. The most recent offer, 6 months old, was $3.8 million for a 15-year exclusive license. She kept their letters in the desk in the study, Tom said, whole folder of them. Maya found the study, small, a roll-top desk, a ceramic owl on the windowsill. Of course there was a ceramic owl, and read through the Cascade Pure correspondence from the beginning. By the time she finished, the light had gone golden, and she understood exactly what her mother had built and why. She also understood, with total clarity, what Gerald Fitch had assumed he was taking when he sat at that mahogany table in his monogrammed cufflinks and made a small sound through his nose. She called Margaret that evening. "I'm at the farm." "How is it?" "It's—" Maya looked out at the last light on the maples. "It's everything," she said. "Good. When you're ready, we'll talk next steps. No rush. There's one I want to move on now, the Attorney General envelope. It's ready to go. Mail it. Consider it done. And Gerald's LLC, the one he ran the transfers through. Mum's letter says it's registered in Illinois. Does he use personal assets as collateral?" A brief silence. "He has a second mortgage on the property he bought last year," Margaret said carefully. "His liquidity isn't what he thinks it is, and if the AG moves forward with civil recovery, which I expect, given what your mother assembled, he'll be personally liable for the full $340,000. Good. I want to know the moment anything moves." It moved in 6 weeks. That's what happens when the documentation is meticulous, and the paper trail runs 18 months deep. Assembled by a woman who used to teach 4th grade and understood, better than most, that details matter. It moves with a quiet inevitability the person on the other end never sees coming until it's standing directly in front of him. Gerald's attorney called him on a Wednesday morning in late November. The Illinois Attorney General's office had opened a civil fraud investigation. The transfers had been traced. His LLC was named in the complaint. His personal assets were subject to a preliminary freeze. He called Maya that same afternoon. She let it go to voicemail. Then she called Margaret, who told her what she already knew. Then she took the pocket watch out of her jacket pocket, turned it over in her palm, and sat with it for a while. The following Monday, Maya drove back to Chicago. She'd arranged through Margaret to meet Gerald somewhere neutral. Not Hartwell and Crane, not the Rockford House, but a small conference room at a title company on Michigan Avenue that Margaret used for mediations. Gerald arrived with his attorney, a man named Patterson, grey suit, an expression of controlled concern. Derek came too, orbiting his father's circumstances the way he always did, like a small anxious moon. Maya arrived alone. She set her tote bag on the table, sat down, and looked at Gerald Fitch across the surface of a conference table for the second time. And the difference between this moment and the one 6 weeks earlier was the difference between standing in a flood and standing on high ground, watching the water move. "You've retained counsel, I assume," Patterson said, glancing at the empty chair beside her. "I don't need counsel for this. This isn't a negotiation." Gerald's expression shifted, just slightly, the easy confidence recalibrating. "Maya," he said, trying warmth as a strategy, "I think we got off to a difficult start in that conference room. These things get emotional. I respected your mother deeply, and I hope we can find a way." "Gerald," her voice wasn't loud. Level, clear. "The Attorney General's office received a formal fraud complaint 6 weeks ago. 18 months of documented wire transfers from joint accounts you controlled. Approximately $340,000 routed through Merchant Bridge LLC, registered to your name in Cook County." She set a folder on the table. "My mother spent 2 years putting that together. She was meticulous." Patterson leaned in. "Mrs. Holloway, any civil matter of that nature should go through the appropriate." "I'm not here about the civil matter. That's already in motion, and I'm only a complainant in it. I'm here to return something." She took the pocket watch from her jacket and set it on the table in front of him. A small, clean click, old gold-filled metal against polished wood, and let it sit there between them. Gerald stared at it. "You sat in that conference room," Maya said, "and let that watch get slid across the table like it was the punchline of something. Maybe it was. To you. But it turns out my mother was a better strategist than either of us gave her credit for. She hid the only thing that mattered in the one place you'd already decided wasn't worth looking at." Gerald's face went still. "What does that mean?" Derek said. Maya kept her eyes on Gerald. "The Hartwell Land Trust is mine. The farm in Vermont is mine. The spring water licensing agreement, I signed it last week, is mine. 3.8 million, 15 years. The fraud documentation is with the Attorney General. Your personal assets are frozen pending investigation, which means that second mortgage on the Naperville property is about to become a much bigger problem." She paused. "My mother didn't do this because she hated you, Gerald. She did it because she loved me. There's a difference." She stood, picked the watch back up, and returned it to her pocket. "It was my grandfather's," she said. "I'm keeping it. I just wanted you to see it one more time." She walked out. She took the elevator down and pushed through the revolving door onto Michigan Avenue, where the November wind came off the lake cold enough to bite through her jacket and sting her eyes, and she stood on the sidewalk in the city, where her mother had grown up and looked up at the gray sky for a moment before she started walking. There was a lot to do. The licensing agreement would close in January. The farm needed a full assessment in the spring. She'd already given notice at the substitute position, a decision that felt surreal and exactly right at once, the way a few correct choices in a life sometimes do. Not dramatic, just true. She'd asked Tom Albright to stay on as caretaker, and he'd said yes without any particular fuss, because Tom Albright was a man who understood that some things are worth continuing. The previous Friday, she'd also mailed a check to the elementary school in Rockford, where she'd taught third grade for 6 years, made out to the classroom library fund, enough to cover new books for every grade in the building. No note attached. She didn't need one. The books would explain themselves. She slid her hand into her pocket and felt the weight of the watch, real and solid, and stopped at 4:47. The moment it had frozen in her grandfather's pocket back in 1994, when the mechanism finally gave out and he looked at it, shrugged, and said that was fine. He never needed to know what time it was, anyway. He needed to know what mattered. She was starting to understand what he meant. "So, here's what I want to ask you, before you go. Because if you're still with us, you've walked every step of this with Maya, from that conference room to the farm to the sidewalk on Michigan Avenue. What would you have done with the watch? Set it on the table and walked away, or kept it, the way she did, as a reminder that the things people dismiss as nothing are sometimes the only things that were ever really yours? Tell us in the comments. And if Maya's story moved you the way it moved us, hit like, share it with someone who needs it today, and subscribe to inherit our drama. There's more coming, and some of it will surprise you even more than this one did.